taxes for Procter & Gamble. And prior to that, he's worked at a number of other major companies like Baxter, and prior to that in public accounting, where he cut his teeth. Tim is an attorney. Tim works on both the day-to-day operations at Procter & Gamble, as well as extensively working with leadership on lobbying type of efforts and structuring and strategic initiatives, and does an extensive amount of work with external advisors and stakeholders. So we thought he'd be the ideal person to provide some information here. We will be doing feedback calls, a little housekeeping items here before I kick it off to Tim. So expect Mel to be reaching out to you to set up calls. And then our next session is on August 21st, and Madeline Barber, who is prior Chief Tax Officer at Tyco and now the head of CBRE, will be providing that session. And we'll send out some information on that in the next couple of weeks. Tim, I'm going to turn this over to you and get started. Mel, would you flip the...
Okay, well, I'm going to try to hopefully share some experiences and accelerate your learning curve through my hard knocks. I've been head of tax for 20 years, and hopefully some things I'll share will make your transition to leadership smoother. We're first going to talk about the board and the audit committee, and I actually think those are two different audiences. So this part of the discussion is talking about how to address the board of directors. I think it's key to know, who your audience is. And the number one person, at least for me, to tell me what the audience wants and what's relevant is my CFO. Because most of the board interactions are actually audit committee for me. I will have either on a very large transaction or on a very material issue, a presentation to the full board, but 75–80% of the time it's the audit committee. And the first thing you should think about is the background of your audit committee members or the full board. And one tip that someone gave me a while ago that I think is worth considering is to reach out to people that know these executives. Most of them, at least in my board, are current or former CEOs. And that means there's a tax person at that organization that probably knows their level of sophistication, their hot button issues. You get a little bit of insight as to how they operate their business, because their questions and their interests may drive off what they are more familiar with. And so to better understand what kind of questions you're going to get and what might be interesting to them, it's a good thing to reach out to your counterparts, the head of tax at these other companies. And likewise, I try to do the same. So I try to share, there's a number of companies, CEOs that are on our board. If we're doing something unusual, I often will reach out to a number of the people I know that are heads of tax at those other companies and give them a heads up if there's something that we're doing that's a little out of the box. What you don't want to do is ambush your counterpart and you have a novel idea and they get cold called from their CEO or their CFO. So first thing is to get the intelligence on the board members and reciprocally to help your counterpart at those other companies. Also, your CFO will know this audience well and know the level of content that they want. So it's pretty important to stay in sync with your boss. And that leads to the second point. The way I think of this, these are never my meetings. They're actually either the CFO's meetings or the CEO's. For audit committee, it's mainly financial. Our CFO has the main role. I'm very happy if I don't have to present at all, or if I'm there just to answer questions, or if my CFO wants me to go further in deep and talk about something in more detail, I'm glad to do that as well. But the point is, it's their meeting. You're not the prime event. You're a supporting cast member. Now as to communication, I think there's a couple of things that are really hard knocks learning for me that I'd like to share. One is these executives are really busy, and it's important to distill the communication. Much of it should be in pre-reading. The way we do our presentations, I may have on the agenda 20 minutes or 30 minutes, but it's a great meeting if I only have to use 5. And if we give the board, after it's been approved by the CFO, the pre-reading 3 weeks in advance or 2 weeks in advance, and it's done well enough, largely most of the questions get answered. And so your presentation could actually be shorter. There's a big difference in how you communicate in your pre-reading. It should be informative. It should be at the level of information it's relevant for them. And you should not be delegating decisions to them. At least the way I think of governance, the management team of the company manages the company. It's not the board of directors. They have a fiduciary oversight role, but they don't day-to-day manage. And so you shouldn't be really presenting questions to the boards. You should be presenting, conclusions, analysis. And if it's a big enough issue, your CFO and CEO are the decision makers after you've made a recommendation and an analysis. Distilling the communication is also critical. We had one issue a couple of years ago that really highlighted this point to me very well. With the beginning of BEPS, we had a country, I won't name the guilty country, but we had a hyper-aggressive audit, and they were using all kinds of strange positions. And ironically, this was a country where we had a bilateral APA in place, and they refused to communicate with the treaty partner that was the APA. And they were doing some things that even under domestic law were probably beyond aggressive, arguably even illegal. And it had to do with holding back lawful refunds on VAT while trying to extort a change in our behavior on income tax, even though we were lawfully entitled to do what we did. And it started to call into question, is this a global systemic problem or not? And we ultimately recommended a slight restructuring of the business model in that country, triggered a relatively small amount of tax, and kind of settled our way out of it. But it took us 3 years to resolve it. And during this period of time, it called into question, is a regional principal structure viable? And in order to distill that for the CEO and the CFO and then for the board, we started with probably, I'd say 45 pages of PowerPoint, knowing full well that's way too much information. And I and my number one lieutenant distilled probably 4 or 5 versions of that data down to what we thought was a really good PowerPoint deck, still relatively long, call it 20 pages. Our CFO looked at it, he says, this is absolutely too long. It's not distilled, keep working it. And he and I redid this 3 more times with the CFO. We finally got it pretty tight. And my CFO is a good communicator. And he in turn then shared the draft with the CEO. And the CEO said, this is not tight enough. We have to distill it further. And the interesting thing about that is, if you really have command of your issue, you can distill it. If your thinking and your analysis is not crisp enough, the distillation process is very difficult. So one of the learnings is effective communication is actually very hard work, and it takes a lot of effort. And it takes multiple efforts to refine and tighten it up. Ultimately, we had a presentation for the CEO that was board ready as pre-reading, and I think it was 8 pages long. But within the 8 pages, there was one slide that was very illustrative of the whole issue. And it was done in a column and row format. And it, at a high level, described our various variations of our business model across the globe, the size of the business in each, by sales, by profit, what exactly are the attributes of that model, and how is it different from the others that we're contrasting, the level of risk, what are the mitigation strategies. And when you glanced at it, we did the entire presentation off that one slide. And at the top, it had a color code. And at the far left was the safest of the business models, and it was in green. And you did this color spectrum where it went towards yellow, towards orange, and then towards red. And at the far right, you had the most extreme aggressive markets. And the ultimate message of that slide was 90% of our business was very stable. Where most of our profits were in very reliable jurisdictions that weren't volatile. And we gave attributes to the places that weren't stable. And many of those things had nothing to do with tax. They were just unstable markets. So the common denominator was they often had currency controls, they often had price controls, they often had high customs duties. These are things that are just general business risk. And when you put it through that lens, the board could say, oh, I get it. This is not a global threat. These are one-off events, and it's manageable. And it turns out, a number of years later, it's been a very accurate description. But to try to get that complex message down to one slide that could describe the globe with all the attributes took a lot of effort. And I think that's something you really should work on if you're trying to communicate to the board. It pays dividends. And lastly, I think tone and confidence. I am not remotely suggesting arrogance, but I am suggesting that if you're in the room, you're the most knowledgeable tax person in the room. Be comfortable with it. These are executives. I know some people kind of get all stiff and worried when they go to the C-suite, but the fact is, by the time you become the number one position, you are an executive as well, and you should be comfortable with that role. You should be able to say, material for this meeting, I can handle this. And you come in very respectful, but confident. So do we want to go to questions? Tony or Melissa, we're good?
Yep. Mel's got a question I think that she wants to pose out that was sent in earlier. So Mel, would you like to bring that up?
Yeah, sorry about that. I had a question is, how do you assess the tax IQ on the board and the audit committee?
Well, I think your mileage will vary, as the automobile companies say. It's very individualistic. There are some board members that are very sharp. Generally speaking, most of the people that have financial acumen have done at least a rotation through the audit committee. And if you think about how the board and the management influence who's on the board, they put them on there for different reasons. Some individuals are there for scientific reasons. Some are there for academic background. It's to balance out the personality of the board. We had one board member who was a former president of a country and financially not a tax person. You have to deal with them differently than you do a CEO for a financial company. We have American Express, Ken Chenault is on our board. He's very sharp. Mr. McInerney from Boeing, retired CEO from Boeing, very sharp. So it's very individualistic, and that's part of that first point. Get to know the different members because they'll have different levels of sophistication.
I have one other question here. How much time should someone invest on knowing their committee's background?
It's an investment you should make early and then keep it fresh. So your biggest time investment is when they're new to the board or you're new in the role. As you get to know them, I've been the head of tax at P&G for almost 15 years. The players are pretty well known, and when there's a new member comes on, I often am participating with other finance leaders and the CFO in giving them a deep dive into our business model, some of the tax drivers, some of the issues. You get to know them that way as well.
Yeah, okay, I think that's all the questions I have. Anyone else has any more questions?
All right, let's move on to the next session. Would you move the slides, Mel?
Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about the outside advisors. And I do think there's a difference between your auditor and your advisors. Ever since Sarbanes-Oxley in early 2000, there's been a sea change, and I think it's coming back towards the middle now. But for a while, it was very difficult in most companies to use your audit firm to do tax planning. Our management and our board still have a preference to not use our auditor for aggressive or even complicated tax planning. If it's a relatively routine outsourcing, the audit firm might have a chance at doing the bidding. But if it's anything that actually requires judgment to review for the financial statements, we don't want them auditing their own work or the appearance that they are. So we generally don't use them as the lead. But I've come to realize it's very expensive and inefficient to keep them in a black box until the quarter end or the year end. So what we have evolved to is we'll develop a concept at least 75%. If it's material, we'll make sure that the audit firm's tax partners get a walkthrough and a general directional buy-in as we refine the details before we launch the transaction. And we then keep them apprised as things develop. There's probably a reloop where we bring them up to speed. Occasionally, they'll have a comment that's really helpful. We're not precluding the fact that they could influence how we do it, but we don't look to them to do that role. Transparency is key there. It's based on trust. And if you want to have a long-term relationship and not a lot of back channel talk to the CFO that you're hiding something, you just have to embrace that you're going to be transparent. Now, your advisors, that's a different thing. And the tension here is between independence and efficiency. The efficiency is you don't want to use a lot of firms because in order for them to be effective, they need to know more than the transaction. They need to know, I'll back up. I view the head of tax and the tax function is the intermediary between the business and the idea. We assess, does it work technically, but equally, does it work from a risk management style? Does it fit the business model? Is it culturally compatible? Do we have the resources to implement it? These are things that could nix a really good idea where it just won't fit. Our job is to help assess, does it fit? Now, if you use too many firms, you're not going to be able to have some assistance in your role in figuring out the fit. Your trusted advisor will have a much better sense of your risk tolerance, your business model, and a general sense of the fit. And therefore, it can be more efficient. But you don't want to be too reliant on one firm because it calls into question, what's your role? Are you being independent or just a echo chamber of an outside firm? The way we've settled in on it is we use both law firms and CPA firms, and we use them for different purposes. When we're doing a public-to-public transaction, over the last 10 years, we've used one New York firm. The reason we use that firm is because they're a very well-known, relatively conservative firm that issues generally will opinions. And if it's a public transaction, every step in the way has to have authority or you don't usually get a will opinion. That's not practical for internal restructurings, and that's not their best use. So when we do internal restructurings, we're more likely to use a second law firm, which is more creative and works well with our accounting for partners. And then lastly, there's a Washington-based firm, has a lot of global reach, a lot of pretty strong offices around the world. We use them on U.S. policy and we use them in foreign offices. And among the big four, we largely, as I just said, don't use our auditors extensively, but we do use E&Y and Price Waterhouse. And we kind of keep them balanced. We give them roughly the same amount of work. It keeps them accountable. It keeps them pursuing efficiency because they realize there's a competitor in the wing. And if you kind of balance it that way with the book of business we have, the size of the professional fees we spend, it fits our style. Now, maybe a company may have less transactions, less professional fee budget. You may not have that many different players, but I would suggest it's a pretty good idea to not rely on one firm, and it's a pretty good idea to use both law firms and accounting firms because they have different purposes. And lastly, and this comes from a company that's evolved, but when I first came to P&G, they were very promote from within, very reluctant to use outside advisors. And I had to culturally evolve the department and my peers in management to the idea that it's okay to use professional firms in the right setting for the right risk. It's like insurance in a way. It's risk management technique, but you ultimately have a fiduciary duty. It's your decision, not the advisor's. You have to make sure the fit is accurate. You have to make sure all the facts are fleshed out and that you're comfortable with the technical soundness of the decision. And in that way, you're sort of partnering with these firms. You're partially relying, but you could never exclusively rely. Do we want to go to questions?
I'm sorry, Tim. I do have one question for you.
Sure.
What is the best advice you would give when facing hostile financial auditors?
Well, the best advice generally is try to not have that setting build up. So I think it's certainly possible you could start off in the wrong spot and you have to kind of evolve your way out of it. But the way you don't have a hostile environment is by building a sense of trust. And so sharing your analysis early, often before you launch on the big ones, and being transparent with them over time will convert them from hostile to partner. Yet you have to realize that with Peekaboo, they can't just blindly trust us. No matter how good we are, no matter how great the team you're leading, they have to have a certain amount of documentation for people to second guess their thoroughness. And that's this Peekaboo group and the peer review within their own firm. And as a result, there is a little bit of checks and balances that they have that you have to be respectful of. And in turn, you have to recognize their role as a checks and balance on us. But I think transparency and building trust over time will get you out of that hole. If you're there, I think the first thing you do is stop digging the hole deeper.
Hey Tim, this is Adam. Piggybacking off that question, would that same advice hold true if someone is stepping into a role where they're maybe inheriting a situation where there's a little more animosity between the audit firm and the company they're going to versus, maybe taking over for somewhere where the relationship's already established?
Sure. In fact, I've experienced that. Part of that is, okay, it's a fresh day. There's a new sheriff in town. When you sit into that new setting, it's a chance to partner. It's a chance for a new day. Part of that is also being willing to say, when I'm right, we're going to stick to our guns. But if I'm wrong, I'm going to concede the point. I inherited a transaction that was done in Japan, had to do with a TK structure for planning types. If executed correctly, it was a very sound transaction, would have saved you the prefecture tax and a better withholding rate than a typical KK structure. And unfortunately, it was executed very poorly. And I came into the role, and this was already under audit. And in that case, the hostility was with the external, was the government. The Japanese tax authority was all over us. And I looked at it not very long and realized it should have worked. If done correctly, it would have worked, but it was done very poorly. And in fact, worse yet, the finance leader in the country nominally supported it, but sabotaged it completely. And had internal emails saying the tax department's making me do this and I don't think it's the right thing. And guess what? The tax authorities got those emails. As soon as we realized that, the only thing to do is concede defeat and move on. And the same is somewhat true with your audit firm. If you have a really strong position, then you do have to stick to your guns. But if you have something that's wobbly, you don't have to own it. You have to make sure your management team realizes the jig is up. But you don't want to take a fight when you can't win. And so with a new audit term or a new role, and now you have the leadership role, I think you should be willing to not be wed to the past and just try to make the right decisions going forward.
Any more questions before we move on to the next? Okay.
Okay. Let's start with the political entities. I think my first caption is the government agencies that you deal with versus the NGOs are two very different audiences, and you need to know the difference. With governments, I think you first have to realize if you're in a lobbying context, it's not just your company that's coming to their office, whether it's U.S. Treasury, it's on the Hill, it's state and local, or it's a foreign government. These comments are universal. The fact of policy is debated, and policy is debated depending on where you sit. And in the U.S., for example, if you're going to Washington, it's not just your point of view that gets shared with government. It's hundreds or thousands of other points of view, each a little different. So you first have to realize you're going to be in it for the long haul, and extreme advocacy is not the strategy that succeeds. And in fact, being a resource when you're not making an ask is the first way to make yourself relevant. If you can help a member or staff understand the issue before it becomes a political issue, just as a general background, that's something that's valuable to them. And you're not making an ask yet. In government affairs, the shorthand is that's a 411 information call that you do before you have a 911 emergency call. If you build the relationship, the door will be more open when you need to have that discussion about an emergency. So my first point is advocacy starts with being a resource to these offices. And equally important, you're in for the long haul. It's not about winning any one issue. And if you overstate your issue or you exaggerate it in extreme, you have to realize that there's going to be 20, 50, 100 different people that will come through that office. And someone will contradict what you're saying in a much more convincing way. They'll point out the shorthand or the sleight of hand that you may have tried. And once the office, the member or the staff realize that you're just an advocate, you're not actually speaking straight, your relevance to that office almost disappears. So you try to win the war, not the individual battles. So be truthful. Part of that is also laying out, the facts, laying out the other arguments, why you see your point of view, but also acknowledging the weakness. If someone says, and they really are sharp enough to catch you and say, well, isn't it true that X, Y, Z, and you don't want to admit to that? Sometimes your best answer is to say, well, actually, that is a problem, and here's why. But then you come back to what you hope is the right answer. But if you try to be one-sided, too strong an advocate, you have to realize there's checks and balances because there's a lot of other parties that come to that same office, and they'll take your position and play it back to someone else. And if someone can effectively rebut it, your credibility's been diminished. So that's kind of a general comment. I always start with the business rationale first. Politics is about anecdotes. It's about small little stories that stick, that people remember. And if you're talking about a technical position first, but not how it relates to your business, it doesn't stick. It's not memorable. And more important for the staffer, it's harder for them to communicate it to their member. And even further than that, if you're talking to a member of Congress, even if they understand your point, they have to distill it to the general public who has no idea what this issue is about. And the currency that really is effective in lobbying is storytelling. It's an anecdote tied to a sticky fact. So as part of that, I would always start my discussions, if I haven't done it already with that office, with how does your business operate? Then you introduce the legal issue, the law or the reg that you're trying to address, and how it impacts the business. You then go to the policy rationale of what's the better answer. And if you take it from that perspective, you've actually not only described your technical issue, but you've made it sticky so they'll remember it. And I think it makes it much more credible, because if it does connect to a business rationale, it's much more compelling that it makes pre-tax sense. It makes them more comfortable that you're not trying to do a sleight of hand. Lastly, know where your arguments take you. This is where experience comes in. I think in order to be an effective political lobbyist, you have to know a fair amount of policy, and you have to build your policy skills over time. So I would suggest OECD is relevant. I would suggest even the UN is influencing internationally how people think of the alternative sets of rules to the OECD. And in turn, they're influencing the OECD. There are policy groups, if you're interested. I think I'm aware of at least 3 of the big 4 have policy groups. I'm in 2 of those firms, they're policy groups. There's another one called the International Tax Policy Forum in the US, and there's a European Tax Policy Forum in Europe. Those are academic type organizations. They sponsor grants to academics to do research on tax policy questions. But you get a different view of the policy when you're getting acquainted with the economic theory behind it. More importantly, and more to that last subpoint, know where your argument takes you. I'll give you a little story. I was involved, in fact, I formed a coalition that helped create a substantial contribution exception to the manufacturing subpart F rules, the branch sales rules of subpart F. And as part of that, I wasn't happy with the state of affairs at the time. I thought if you had a lot of substance, you shouldn't have a problem with these rules. And as I talked with others that were familiar with government, and some that were in government, they sort of agreed. And so I formed a group, and we had a number of companies participate in that group. And what I discovered is that some of the people in the room were making political arguments about jobs in a meeting that was held by Senate Finance staff and the Joint Committee on Tax. And one of them made an argument that said, we need this exception so we could preserve U.S. jobs. And the extension of that comment was that they actually had IP offshore and tried to contract manufacture supervise the U.S., in effect, U.S. base erode. And it didn't take Tom Berthal more than about 2 seconds to realize what it meant. And he went around the room and said, are you doing this? Are you doing this? It didn't apply to us, so we said no, but 2 or 3 of the others got kind of boxed into a corner where they had to admit that they had a pretty aggressive approach to the U.S. tax policy. And it was because they were making a political argument in a technical setting. So know your argument and know where it takes you. Now, NGOs, completely different animal. They're both political, but you have to realize the NGOs have a different purpose. In fact, someone described it to me as it's almost like they're a living organism separate from their stated purpose, because ultimately they need donors, they need volunteers, and they need enthusiasm. And therefore, they actually need a villain. They need a unifying force to rally against. And sometimes they're going to create a villain if they have to. So being logical you can't assume that you can be logical with an NGO and have them respectfully interact with you, because it may violate their other purpose, which is they need a villain, and they've decided maybe you're the villain. So where it takes you is, at least with the civil society types, you have to be careful with them. They may have good intentions, but ultimately, even if the person you're talking to is very reasonable, another part of that same organization may attack your company. In the past, in the last 10 years, in Europe, they vilified companies by saying, you're not paying enough tax in Africa country X. And as a result, 1.6 million babies have died. And it's a stretch to make that argument, but they're basically saying because there's not enough revenue, there's not enough safety net in that country, and it's your fault. Now, the fact is, under international rules, you're probably doing nothing wrong. But they actually want the multinationals to pay more tax in these countries, irrespective of the arm's length standard or the activity performed in that country. You have to understand that context and their motivation when you're talking to, quote, civil society. OECD, on the other hand, are basically tax administrators from the member countries. They're political, but they're also much closer to talking to a government, talking to a policy-grounded discussion most of the time. And you can probably get a different kind of a climate and a different kind of discussion in OECD than you can in a UN setting, or worse yet, Citizens for Tax Justice or the Tax Justice Network, or there's a whole series of these groups, these quote civil society groups. So know which audience you have and understand what their motivations are. Mel, Tony?
Let's open this up for questions.
Yep. I have a question regarding political entities. How much historical preparation do you do on past interactions with a particular group or individuals?
Well, first, I alluded to it. You want to build a relationship before the emergency. That's my reference to the 411 call before the 911 call. So hopefully they're a known commodity. Hopefully before you have a direct issue, they're a little bit familiar with how your business operates. You may not always have that option. It may be that something's thrust upon you and you have to compress the background with the ask in the same meeting. The amount of preparation is a function of the relationship. The deeper your relationship with a certain member office, probably the less prep you have to do. But if it's almost a cold call, if this is your first meeting, then it's a good thing to try to understand who that staffer is, what's the record of that office, and you do more prep. But part of the constituent relationship, particularly if they represent your headquarter jurisdiction, or if you have a large plant in their jurisdiction, their district or their state, hopefully you've built that relationship and they've already seen your facility. They already know how many employees are in their district. But If they haven't, I'd bring that fact sheet along. We generally have a fact sheet for every district that we have a presence. It says what our sales are, what our headcount is, what our payroll is. It gives them some factoids as to our connection with that district. If those aren't compelling arguments, but we have a large supplier, third-party supplier, we'll also make sure they know that as well, because they're interconnected with us. And our success becomes that other company's constituent success. Does that make sense?
Yes. I have a participant's question here, Tim.
Sure.
In today's difficult political environment for large corporations, how do you identify the right politician, political groups with whom to interact? Do you pick only friendly groups or also take on adversaries?
Well, you don't get to pick your environment. I think you need to have a dialogue with most. It's best to have a champion who represents your home district or your large presence in a given state, and they feel kind of constituent connection. I wouldn't say ownership, but you're relevant to them. That's usually the best relationships you can have. You look at their voting record, and I think some companies make a pretty big mistake. They politically are black and white. They're either pro-Democrat or pro-Republican. That's not how we run our political action committee. We actually look at their voting records for the issues that we've prioritized, and we try to understand on like a 1 to 10 scale, are they friend or foe? Even if they're a foe, they need to know your issue. They need to know how their policy bias or persuasion impacts your business and therefore employment in their district or their state. But those conversations are always easier if you look at their voting record and on your relevant issues, they're sympathetic to your point of view, then it's much easier. But I would not say you avoid the tough meetings. You prepare better for them, and you do take them, because they need to know what their choices do to some of the constituents in their state. Even if it doesn't change their mind, it's important they know.
Tim, I have a question. This is Adam again on for individuals that are at companies that aren't as large as P&G, where there may only be one person that gets involved in any kind of discussions with political entities or an NGO or something like that. And then again, with the idea that someone in a second tier spot would be moving into the top spot for the first time or something like that. And how would someone be proactive about getting some of this experience if the opportunities are limited within their company? Do you have any ideas or suggestions of how someone might be able to go about that? Because it seems like this is a pretty critical skill set to learn in the current environment.
Yeah, I agree. Well, first I would say it's a partnership, so it's not usually one person. To give you a sense of it, I don't ever speak externally without permission from our communications and government relations. We have a committee between tax, GR, and communications on whether we can speak. And it's not because necessarily the topic, it's because sometimes there's something else going on that you're not even aware of that makes it relevant to decide whether or not your company should be on the public dais or be on, any kind of quotable forum. To make that more concrete, we had a series of challenges with our Tide Pods. They're a fantastic product. We've redesigned the lids and the childproof container 3 different times. And the dilemma has been, unfortunately, it looks more appealing than a bottle of bleach, but it's every bit as dangerous potentially. And a child, as long as the parents keep the pods in the jar, they're quite safe. But often people would take a few of them in a Ziploc to a laundromat, and they won't secure the pods. And we've had instances where kids have ingested a pod. And I'm not talking about the kids at college that are doing these crazy dares, but I mean, a child does it. And as a result, there was a period of time where there was pretty intense political pressure against P&G. During that period, even though there was probably worthwhile things from a tax standpoint to go talk to a particular organization, we had a don't go public phase where no one was speaking externally except in a controlled environment, anticipating this issue could pop up, even though that's not the topic of the meeting. So number one, partner with people. It's not just the tax person doing it by themselves. When I go to the Hill, I never go alone. I'm with either an outside advisor that government relations has approved, or I'm with someone from government relations. I would say with that as background, there should be a succession planning opportunity and exposure where the head of tax will allow the lieutenant or the up-and-comer to get some exposure in at least a limited opportunity. You can't just throw people in cold turkey. It takes years to get really good at this. I've been doing this most of 20 years. The first couple of years, looking back, it was embarrassingly amateurish, but to make your company more effective, you got to kind of get people comfortable. There should be a little bit of sharing of this work.
That makes sense.
And to be honest, there's times where there's a grassroots effort. You can't cover enough offices with one person. The divide and conquer. I go with, two more tax people, and we each go with somebody from the government affairs office, and we're hitting 3 meetings at once. If it's a hot issue, that's the way to do it. Well, that's the kind of opportunity that you can bring some of the team along, maybe give them a less sophisticated audience, less difficult member office to go visit, but they get the experience of doing it, and they've got a GR person with them.
Sure, yeah.
Mike Casella had a question. He's having some trouble getting through, Tim. He's from your old stomping grounds. He's over at right now over at Baxter. His question was revolving around when you're part of a coalition. So he chatted this to me just a minute ago.
Sure.
What happens when you're part of a coalition, and what's the best way to navigate an issue when you're with the Hill, when that coalition's position, like an industry group, differs from the specific member's position?
That happens a lot. In fact, sometimes you join groups to watch the others. You sometimes want to know what else is going on, and the role with that particular group might be just to stay informed as opposed to use them as your most effective communication channel. If you're at odds, you should understand what the role of the coalition is, and it may be separate from your issue. So take the recent tax bill. I'm co-chair of a group called ACT. It's roughly 40 companies from many different industries, and we are sending in comment letters pretty regularly, both trying to influence it while it was being drafted and now in the regulatory process. Some of the members have a one company issue, and it's really important to them, but relative to the coalition, it's kind of off center. It's not our prime issue, and it might even be a stretch to say it's a reasonable ask. As the co-chair of that group, we discuss what we can cover and what we won't. And there's times we have to go back to a member and say, I understand your point of view. We encourage you to take it on your own, but our group can't go there because it's off task, it's off message. So I think having a realistic understanding of what the coalition's achieving and what's reasonable within their scope and what's kind of beyond the scope of a group is part of effectively using a coalition. And if it's something that's critical to you, I think you have to there's a way to do it so you can not be viewed as a saboteur or a contrarian to the group. But if you have to represent your company's point of view, then you have to represent it. And it's possible that although that coalition is 85, 90% of the time aligned with you, you might find an issue that's critically important to your company and your coalition's going the other way. My suggestion is just be transparent about that with whoever's leading the group. Usually it's your peer. And you say, look, this is really important to us. I understand the group dynamics. I'm not asking the group to do this, but I've got to represent my company. And on this issue, we got to go a separate way. And I think the odds are they're going to find out if you have a different point of view and you went your separate way. So you might as well be transparent about it. And people understand you each have a fiduciary duty to your employer. So it's not an unreasonable position to have.
I think that probably wraps up all the questions on this section. Mel, you want to move the slide, please, for the final section?
Auditors. Okay. The world's changed a lot since I started doing this. It used to be hide the ball was the main audit technique, and transparency was not a description that usually applied to the relationship between a taxpayer and the agency that audits us. But a lot has changed. And I now take the view, particularly because we're a consumer products company, and so things that we do could affect reputation, and in turn, in theory, if it's bad enough, could affect sales. If you take an outrageous tax position and it becomes public and notorious, there's the possibility someone's going to, energize a group to say we should boycott that company because they're a bad company. You never want to have a tax position affect the sales line. So I think in today's environment, I generally operate under, you assume that the tax authorities know all the facts or will know them all. And therefore, the day of the hyper-technical tax planning with not a lot of substance or purpose, I think is gone. In fact, I think it's the beginning of the end was probably close to, almost 20 years ago. If you look at some of the BEPS projects since roughly 2000, they had a business restructuring. They had what eventually became the income attributable to permanent establishment. You've got the change in the PE threshold. These are iterations of the same theme. They all require business purpose and substance. And I think it's reasonable to say in this day and age, you have to assume that in order to be defendable, it has to be more than technical. You have to have substance and business purpose, a pre-tax rationale, and it should be pretty compelling. There's a lot of countries that now have general anti-avoidance rules, GAR rules, and that's on top of BEPS and other rules. So generally, this trend has been coming, and it's not going to get any easier. I think it'll get even worse than it is now. So, and I think the digital taxation discussion that's currently going on in tax policy is going to make BEPS look like it was easy. BEPS kind of affects the fringe. The digital taxation debate is actually going to go further than that. So I think it influences what type of transactions you do and how you report them. Our main rationale is tax follows the business. Chips fall. There's times where we have a tax outcome that clearly was not designed by the tax department, but it met a pre-tax reason, and that's the reason we did it. At one point, we had Japan as one of the headquarters for the part of the Asia region. As the highest tax rate country in the region or the world, you wouldn't make Japan, from a tax standpoint, your principal structure. But that it was the regional headquarters for Asia. And that was because of pre-tax reasons at the time. They no longer were true pre-tax, and we've subsequently unwound it. But sometimes it's good to do things that are pre-tax driven that are not great tax results. You just write those down and remember them. And when people challenge you, bring that fact back out. That all leads to APAs. I've been an advocate for transparency and for APAs for a long time. It's not because I'm Pollyannic or I want to have some social justice outcome. It's because for me, it's pragmatic. I have very good facts. I have a lot of business substance, and that's the reason I'm leveraging these rulings, because it's easier for me to get them with my good facts. But if I go back 10 years, if you looked at our financial statements, you could tell that we had a fair amount of transfer pricing reserve because we have a pretty complicated cross-border supply chain. And as a result, we had tax reserves well in excess of $2 billion. We now have 17 countries with APAs. We have 10 more countries pending. And sometimes these take a long time. They can take 5 to 6, 7 years. But eventually, we've been able to lock them down, and we've been able to renew them. And when I complete the ones that are already in process and maintain the ones I have, I'll have almost 90% of my cross-border transactions covered by an APA. So what does that mean? It means I don't have to have transfer pricing reserves. Our financial statements from last year went 10 years ago, $2 billion of TP reserves. We're now to $475 million. And we don't have to calculate interest on that balance. So I'm a believer that in this world, with all the uncertainty and the changing rules, transparency is an advantage. And even things like ICAP, we're in the pilot program for ICAP, which is the OECD trial. It's essentially a PE and transfer pricing review by multiple countries. And we have 6 countries simultaneously reviewing us right now. Ultimately, if they think we're okay, we're going to get a low-risk designation from all 6 countries. I think that's valuable. So that's kind of my transparency speech in a couple minutes.
Let's move.
Do we have any questions?
I've got
an earlier question. I apologize for the background noise. I think everybody can call in now. I think we had a little technical issues, and I think there's a background noise now, but you can call in with questions. But I did have one of the participants ask me about an issue back on an earlier screen around the board of directors and the audit committee. Their particular company has a strong preference for only the head of tax to be able to present in these forums. Your suggestions on how a number 2 gets themselves positioned in a case like that?
Well, actually, that's generally the rule of thumb for our company as well. My number 2 has done it, I think, twice in the last 10 years because schedules were impossible. Somebody muted me. So our company's policy is generally the same. In fact, my number 2 is only presented twice in the last 10 years, and it was because of unique conflict schedule problems. But I do think partnering with the head of tax and the number 1 or 2 behind them on the slides, on the discussion of what you're going to talk about, how you're going to build that PowerPoint presentation. There's ways to share the content without being in the room. It's not as good, but it's the next best thing. And ultimately, you're right. There's not an entourage that goes to those meetings, and generally the board expects only the head to be at that meeting.
We're having some pretty bad feedback coming on. Mel, can you change back the settings? If anybody has questions, additional ones, just chat them in for right now. I think that's probably the most effective way.
I've unmuted, but it looks like everyone else is muted. So what Tony said was if you could chat in or send an email, they could then unmute their phone and we can try to reply.
Tim, can you hear me now?
I can.
Mel, can you add in the additional questions that were chatted in, please?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, Tony. You were
Can you bring
echoing.
up the additional questions that were chatted in?
Yes. Okay, I have a question here from one of the participants. Does your philosophy towards agencies vary based on if you are dealing with a federal or state agency?
Truthfully, I rarely get involved with a state agency. I'm much more likely to talk to a foreign government than I am to a state agency. But that's part of our reach. We have 65% of our sales outside the U.S. Everything's about scale and materiality. So I believe in leveraging as much as you can. If the state issue is material, more senior leadership has to be involved. But if it's medium level of maturity, I would think it's appropriate that someone in the team, but not necessarily the function head, would be the one that takes the lead. And I also think the function head should not be readily going to these audit meetings. You're used as more of a second or third tier resource after they've exhausted a series of meetings and elevations. I just came back from Argentina yesterday. If people had really good recall, about 5 years ago, the government accused us of all kinds of nonsense, and they shut us down. They revoked all of our licenses for 8 days, and we're still in the process of unwinding that. My local team and my regional director for Latin America have had many meetings, but occasionally I go see people more senior to escalate it further. So I think the same principle applies whether you're talking a state government, the federal IRS team, or international. Based on materiality, you should use the right level staffing, and that's the interaction day to day, and then you escalate as you need it. And that includes, by the way, if it's tough enough, it doesn't stop with the head of tax. One thing I inadvertently came upon that turned out to be a very good thing, we had a very contentious issue in the Philippines. And we had run through the whole gamut of the local team, the regional team, myself, and it was very contentious. And our CEO at the time had prior career experience living in the Philippines and felt very much that he could help out. And to be honest, my CFO thought that was less of a good idea. But the CFO was willing to go with me to go meet the Minister of Finance and the head of the Tax Commission. And it was the appropriate escalation, but a funny byproduct occurred. It's one thing to describe a very contentious audit to someone who's never in the room. It's a very different thing when they're in the room with you, because we were talking to a crazy person. And my boss has never had, he's had a much higher respect for our audit issues and how we're dealing with difficult governments, having experienced himself personally at one time in the Philippines with a very contentious thing, which, by the way, we ultimately did resolve. But I think it's escalation based on materiality and your recourse. You just put the right resources, and then if you have to escalate, you do. The same applies to state and local. Tony, you're muted. I can see you're talking, but.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. This is another question from Mike. It's regarding going about educating the CFO, audit committee, that there remains uncertainty around the 2018 and future years ETR, given all of the unanswered questions still remaining around U.S. tax reform.
Right.
How have you gone about doing that?
Well, we do it by topic, and then we do a high, a low, and a likely assessment of each of the uncertainties. And some of them are puts and calls. It's possible you get lucky and they're offsetting, variables. One goes up and one goes down. But it's fair to say it's a very complicated bill. The way I've described it, it's as if you had a 10-story building and then they decided to put 15 more stories on top of it without changing the foundation. Because what we did was we put a lot of new concepts on an old foundation. It doesn't quite match up.
Hey, Tim, I have one more question from one of the participants here. If you step into a situation where your CFO has a different philosophy towards audit resolutions than you have, for example, you have a CFO that would rather go to court over issues versus settling. Do you have any suggestions about how you go about educating him or her on how your approach may be better for the shareholders in the long run?
Sure. Ultimately, it's going to be their call, certainly if it's material. But going back to that Philippines analogy I just gave you, one of my CFO's comments was saying, you can do this alone, but if you do it alone and it goes bad, you're alone. He says, if you engage the management team, we're working it together. It's our problem, and we'll own it together. So the reciprocal of that comment is, but if your CFO feels for whatever reason you either should settle or shouldn't, by all means have a discussion. You might even bring in your best trusted advisor with you to validate or at least explain further. But ultimately, it's his P&L, not yours, or her P&L. And so I think it's the humility of your role to realize if it's material enough, it is not your call. Part of the art of doing the job is to realize you're either to decide something and inform your boss, or you're to analyze and recommend and let them decide. So I give the example of the Glaxo case, which most people should be somewhat familiar with. I think on the merits, you could certainly argue technically they should have litigated. It's not clear the IRS position made sense. They were arguing that the U.S. selling jurisdiction had unique intangibles, and generally the IRS does not make that argument. In the foreign context and competent authority, they make the opposite argument, that the selling jurisdiction is not unique. And yet, from the management standpoint, they settled that case because it was very expensive and very distracting to all of their senior management. So ultimately, whether you settle or whether you don't, if the numbers are big enough, it's probably not the head of tax's call.
Tim, I'm going to just give everybody a quick chance, see if there's any other questions. We're running to the end of the time, but want to make sure if anybody has any questions, they bring them up to the group here.
Sure.
We'll chat them into Mel. Tim, as we wrap up in this topic, is there one or two specific things you'd really try to impress on everybody that they should walk away from this with, that at the end of the day will give them the most value in return for the time they put into it?
Yeah, the biggest thing of all is that the premium on effective communication relative to the setting. We've talked about 5 different unique settings. The effective communication and external relationship in those settings is a soft skill that's become more and more important. And you should treat that as a parity requirement to technical skill. For a long time, people thought this is a technician's job. It's a black box. Magician waves their wand and no one gets a chance to ask why. That's not the way it is today. You have to have buy-in from management. You have to have effective communication externally. These soft skills are critically important. And as the world becomes flatter, more transparent, as our financial statements disclose more information, as country by country reporting becomes publicly reported, it's going to get worse. And therefore, the transparency and the communication premium for the leader is going to continue to escalate. So put your energy in being a better, effective communicator, because that's really what you are. You're above the technicians as the head of the function, trying to connect the function to the company and the company to external world.
Yeah, I cannot stress this enough. When we're approached to do an external search for a client for a number one chief tax officer role, and I ask them why there isn't people ready to step up, it is hardly ever a technical issue. It is 90% of the time they don't have the communication skills, the strategic business judgment skills that we're looking for. The board doesn't have confidence in those areas that we're asked to go and focus on besides the technical assumptives. So I 100% agree with this.
Well, lucky for me.
It might be the first time, right, Tim? I've agreed with you lately.
Yeah. Well, you know what, Tony? It's next year. It's 30 years ago we first worked together.
Wow, you're getting old. Everybody, thank you so much. And Tim, I can't thank you enough on how busy you are. Tim's running on fumes, coming in from a red eye overnight to jump in and do this for you guys. So hopefully everybody got a lot out of it. Remember, on the forum, if you pose additional questions, we'll make sure those get to Tim to get addressed and answered. So take advantage of that for those who didn't have the opportunity to get questions answered here, or if you were listening to this on the recording. Mel will be sending out information on the final last session of this initial Symposia group within the next 2 weeks. So keep your eyes open for that as well. Tim, thank you again, buddy.
Hey, it's been fun.
Some shut-eye now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.